The God element. Why life runs on phosphorus? To understand how we got into this mess, look at what your cells whisper every second. ATP. Phosphorus is the P in adenosine triphosphate, the tiny rechargeable battery that pays for every move your body or a plant makes. Snap one phosphate off, get energy, stick it back on, store it. That powers every heartbeat, every root tip, every grain filling out in a summer field. It's not just ATP either. DNA and RNA are held together by a phosphate backbone. Bones and teeth. Calcium phosphate. Seeds. Packed with phytic acid, a phosphorus savings account. There's no substitute, no swap, no knockoff. You either have phosphorus or life slows to a crawl. Plants are incredibly picky about their timing, especially early on when those tiny roots are still figuring out where to go in the dirt. They need phosphorus for energy transfer and cell division right at the start, and if they miss that specific window, you can't really make it up later in the season. Farmers know this deep in their bones, which is why they place fertilizer as close to the seed as possible to make sure they chase every last bushel. When they get the timing right, the roots explode through the soil and the plants set way more flowers, which makes the final yields jump. When things go wrong, you start seeing purple corn leaves and stunted wheat next to empty pods, and that is what I call a silent fail. Here is the catch. The stuff we spread on our fields doesn't just appear out of thin air like magic. We have to mine phosphate rock from sedimentary deposits that were laid down over millions of years in ancient seabeds, and then we turn that rock into fertilizers like MAP or DAP. You shouldn't mix this up with elemental phosphorus, which is a dangerous industrial material made in massive, white-hot furnaces. Farmers only care about plant-available phosphate, and that entire pipeline runs from the rock mine through acid plants and into the granules that eventually hit the soil. It is a one-way stream that disappears forever unless we find a way to grab what leaks out of the system. You might be surprised to learn that we actually cannot synthesize new phosphorus no matter how hard we try. We managed to snatch nitrogen from the sky using the Haber-Bosch process, but phosphorus is an element, which means geology sets a hard ceiling on what we have. What is sitting underground is all we are ever going to get, and the reality is that not all rock is created equal. High-grade ore is the easy, clean stuff that makes fertilizer cheap, but as those grades drop, you have to dig more and use more acid. This leaves behind bigger waste stacks, and as the costs creep up, the pollution gets worse too. That is why people are starting to worry about peak phosphorus, because it isn't that the planet is running out of atoms, but rather that the affordable supply can't keep up with our hunger. We have already seen some scary glimpses of what happens when the market gets tight. Every time global food demand jumps or fuel prices spike, the phosphate markets start to twitch and act crazy. Farmers are always the first ones to feel the sting, so they start delaying their fertilizer applications or cutting their usage rates. The result is that crop yields begin to wobble and food prices at the store start to rise, which is exactly how a quiet mineral becomes a full-blown kitchen table panic. Meanwhile, there is something else happening deep in the soil that most people never notice. For decades, we spread way more phosphorus than the plants could actually use in a single growing season. A lot of that extra material locked onto soil particles and built up over time, which scientists call legacy P. You can think of it as a slow-motion savings account hidden in the dirt. And the good news is that smarter farming can actually tap into that reserve. The bad news is that heavy rain can wash it all into the nearest river where it feeds massive algae blooms. Now we are essentially paying for it twice, once to buy the fertilizer and again to clean up the mess it made in the water. Now remember, this isn't just a science story, it's a map of power. High-grade phosphate is spread unevenly, and a huge chunk sits under North Africa. Most of it is concentrated in Morocco and the disputed Western Sahara, where the state-backed giant OCP runs the pits, ports, and plants, controlling the chain from the mine to the bag. That's massive leverage when farmers from India to Europe need what comes off that desert conveyor belt. Here's a fun fact. Seeds hoard phosphorus so aggressively that how we process food shuffles the mineral in weird ways. We grow feed, give it to animals, ship the meat across the world, and dump the bones far from the fields that grew the grain. Cities flush it, lakes bloom with slime, and dead zones spread when nitrogen and phosphorus arrive together like gasoline and a lit match. Because apparently, we're world-class at moving nutrients exactly where they shouldn't be. And then we act shocked when the bill shows up. So you might wonder why we don't just engineer our way out of this problem with fancy technology. People are certainly trying, and we're seeing new crops with roots that can unlock bound phosphorus or microbes that help the plants eat better. There are even enzymes like phytase that we put in animal feed so that less phosphorus ends up wasted in the manure. These inventions definitely help, but they don't change the base reality that biology needs this element every single season. You can stretch a tight budget as far as you want, but you simply cannot print new atoms. What nobody realized the first time the prices spiked was how quickly the cities and big companies would start pointing fingers at each other. The farmers say they need the chemicals to feed the world, while the water utilities say they are stuck cleaning up whatever flows downhill. The fertilizer executives claim it's just a temporary logistics problem, and meanwhile, regular households see their grocery bills jump and assume it's all just corporate greed. There is probably a little bit of truth and blame to go around for everyone, but the laws of physics really don't care about our feelings. When that high-grade rock supply tightens up, every single person downstream is going to feel the pressure. To understand how that grip on our food supply actually formed, we need to travel to the desert. That is where a 100-kilometer conveyor belt carries the rock of ages out to the sea, and we need to rewind to the last time the world chased phosphorus like it was pure gold. The Morocco monopoly, OCP, and the rock of ages. Imagine endless wind and grit and a single conveyor that never stops. At the Boukra mine in western Sahara, massive machines drop rock onto a belt that runs nearly 100 kilometers to the Atlantic. It looks like a moving horizon of phosphate rolling toward ships that feed farms half a world away, but that belt is more than steel and rubber. It's geopolitical leverage you can see from space. The blunt math of the situation is that most of the world's high-grade phosphate rock sits in Morocco and the territory it occupies, western Sahara. While experts might argue over the exact definitions or estimates, the center of gravity never shifts because this specific patch of North Africa holds the ultimate mother lode. Sitting right on top of all that wealth is OCP, a state-backed giant that runs the pits, the chemical plants, the ports, and the international contracts. They don't just sell raw rock, but instead provide finished fertilizer from massive complexes like Jorf Lasfar, where rail lines bring in slurry while acid plants hum and granulation towers spit out DAP and MAP like candy. This is vertical control from one end of the chain to the other. Do you remember that sudden price spike you felt at the grocery store recently? If we roll back to 2008, phosphate prices shot up several times over, and the same thing happened again in the early 2010s and during the 2021-2022 season. Farmers everywhere delayed their purchases and food prices surged, yet in the middle of all that chaos, OCP booked record-breaking revenue. This didn't happen because they broke the market, but because when demand runs hot and alternatives are thin, the player sitting on high-grade ore and massive plants gets to set the entire tempo. Whether it is India putting out tenders or European buyers looking for a deal, OCP stays at the table to lock in long-term deals and keep ships moving while smaller producers start to blink. But here's where it gets messy. Western Sahara isn't just a desert full of rock, it's a disputed territory where the Sahrawi people claim self-determination. European courts have flagged cargoes as conflict phosphate. Some buyers quit entirely, pension funds divested, activists track ship names in real time. OCP says the mines bring jobs and development. Critics say the resource is taken without consent to finance an occupation. And through all of it, the belt keeps running. Inside the country, the strategy for OCP looks less like a company plan and more like a massive national project. They invest in everything from lifting ore quality to building fertilizer plants specifically tailored to the unique soils of their customers. Because they have state backing, they can use patient capital to bankroll research and create custom blends for African markets while dredging ports and securing power lines. When other countries start to wobble due to export bans or gas shocks, OCP leans in to grab more market share. It is a brilliant business move, but it also functions as serious geopolitical muscle. What most people outside of the industry didn't see right away was the quiet power of ore grade. High-grade ore saves a fortune on acid and energy while cutting out impurities like cadmium that regulators absolutely hate. As other regions are forced to mine lower-grade rock, their costs go up and their environmental headaches start to multiply. Morocco can keep its profit margins fat while everyone else is sweating, and that gap eventually becomes a matter of government policy rather than just simple pricing. The EU is constantly worrying about both fertilizer security and contamination limits, which forces importers to weigh the cost against the ethics of the source. India has huge subsidy bills and millions of small farmers who need a predictable supply, so you can bet the phone lines to Casablanca stay very warm. Across the world, competitors are desperately trying to claw back some relevance in this market. China has plenty of rock and capacity, but they often throttle their exports to protect their own domestic supply and keep local prices down. The US has companies like Mosaic and plenty of tariffs, but they also deal with limited high-grade ore and a mountain of internal politics. North Africa still holds the ace in this game, and every time the Bukra belt turns, it transforms grain by grain into leverage you can actually feel in bread lines. There is a human layer to this story that never shows up on a corporate balance sheet. You have miners working in the desert wind, dockworkers watching dust drift off a ship's hold, and farmers in India hitting refresh on a tender price. A co-op manager in France might be wondering if the next cargo will clear customs without a massive lawsuit, proving these aren't just abstract ideas. They are the living edges of a global system held together by rock, acid, and a mountain of paperwork. Here's a fun fact. A single conveyor belt can actually shape what an entire continent eats for dinner. However, that conveyor lives inside a legal gray zone and a harsh climate reality where storms shut down ports and droughts snarl hydropower. When OCP decides to flex its muscles, they can smooth out the bumps for some people while squeezing the margins for everyone else. When they stumble, the ripple effect is absolutely wild. And the market finally realized that a global resource was actually just a choke point with a flag. The stakes here are incredibly high for everyone involved. If exports slow down because of a strike or a court order, prices jump and small farmers are usually the first ones to cut back on their fertilizer. Yields begin to sag and food inflation follows shortly after, which forces governments to spend more on subsidies and less on everything else. Even if the supply keeps flowing, the fight over the ethics of Western Sahara isn't going away anytime soon. To understand how we got so vulnerable to a single belt in the desert, we have to look back at the last mad dash for phosphorus. It was a time when ships chased bird dung and people literally dug up the dead just to feed the living. Guano to glory, the first phosphorus rush. Picture ships edging up to islands that look like giant loaves of sugar. As the crew gets closer, the smell turns sharp and sour, like a chicken coop baked in the sun for a century. They're not hunting gold or spices, but mountains of bird droppings on Peru's Chincha Islands in the mid-1800s. This was the first great phosphorus rush. Did you know that guano is loaded with so much nitrogen and phosphorus that it could turn a dying field into a green carpet overnight? For years, farmers had been barely scraping by using basic manure, but then samples from the Pacific reached London and yields suddenly exploded. Contracts were signed instantly, and the Peruvian treasury began to swell with cash. Whole shipping lines switched over to the guano trade because the profit margins were simply too good to ignore. Here's a fun fact. The US actually passed the Guano Islands Act in 1856. I mean, seriously, Congress basically told citizens that if they found an unclaimed island covered in poop, they could plant a flag and the military would back them up. Dozens of tiny specks in the Pacific and Caribbean were claimed almost overnight, even if they were just rocks with a few birds. Crews would land and set up ramps to start scraping away at a nutrient bank that had been building up for thousands of years. But this rush came with a devastating human cost. On the Chincha Islands, the labor was absolutely brutal for the convicts and kidnapped workers who had to shovel under a white-hot sun. The dust was so caustic that it burned their lungs and eyes, while overseers pushed for higher and higher quotas. Ships were loaded day and night as the piles of guano shrank and the money poured through Lima like water. Because easy money always makes people sloppy, massive corruption bloomed right alongside the export business. While all of this was happening, Europe's hunger problem finally started to ease up. For a short while, bird poop literally meant bread for the masses, and cities began to swell as fields no longer needed to sit empty. But the game of squeezing nutrients out of the earth took a much darker turn when guano prices started to rise. Entrepreneurs began looking for bone phosphate, and by that, they meant actual human bones. Get this, by the mid-1800s, bone merchants were raiding old graveyards and famous battlefields. After the Napoleonic Wars, scavengers dug up mass graves and hauled cartloads of remains to grind into fertilizer. British ports took in huge shiploads labeled animal bones, and everyone knew a share came from places like Waterloo. Across Europe, bones from slaughterhouses joined the stream. When yields are on the line, ethics get blurry fast. History shows us that behind our neat product labels and sanitized supply chains, people once had their hands elbow-deep in dust and human remains. When phosphorus runs short, the lines that people swear they would never cross start to get blurry very fast. Governments wrote brand new laws just to grab tiny islands, and merchants were willing to pay for graveyard dirt. You really can't separate food security from the desperate ways people bend the rules to protect it. This rush for nutrients also lit the fuse for major international wars. Guano wasn't the only thing people wanted, but fertilizer value was at the heart of every regional fight in South America. The Chincha Islands War and the later War of the Pacific pulled Peru, Bolivia, and Chile into a violent spiral over who controlled the mineral wealth of the coast. Fleets shelled ports and ironclads fought at sea, because fertility was just as important as the flags flying over the territory. Eventually, the guano windfall in Peru began to fade away. The best deposits were thinned out, and the state's fictitious prosperity finally cracked under the weight of massive debt. Guano hadn't built a real economy, but had instead funded a giant binge that left the country struggling. Farmers in Europe were now hooked on these external nutrients, so they needed a new answer when the ships finally slowed down. That pressure is what drove the rise of industrial fertilizers, starting with rock reacted with acid and leading up to the famous Haber-Bosch process. Meanwhile, the same environmental patterns we see today were already starting to show up in the water. Guano and bone ash made the fields look lush, but the runoff from those farms didn't care about anyone's financial ledgers. Streams began to turn green around treated land, and cities spread waste without ever closing the loop. The idea of recycling nutrients back to the fields got thinner as global trade grew, and we were essentially learning how to waste resources at a massive scale. Let's be honest, the lesson here is both ugly and very clear. When the nutrient that holds all of life together gets scarce or expensive, ethics go out the window and governments move with a speed you only see when stomachs are empty. The first phosphorus rush gave us booming yields, but it also gave us raided graves, forced labor, and war. It set a template that we still follow today. Grab what is easy, push the costs onto someone else, and worry about the water later. Because apparently, the rush for these minerals never really ends. It just changes its source and its dress code, moving from bird cliffs and bone mills to massive acid towers and export tenders. The waste that we choose to ignore in 1 century inevitably becomes the crisis that the next generation has to drink. The algae apocalypse, when fertilizer kills the ocean. While massive ships were busy hauling rock across the desert, rainwater was doing the exact opposite back on the farm by pulling phosphorus right off the fields and dragging it downhill. It starts in a little ditch, moves to a creek, and eventually hits a river that really doesn't care how much the farmer paid for that fertilizer. Nitrogen and phosphorus usually show up to the party together like a double shot of espresso, which makes the algae go absolutely wild until the fish can't even breathe. Here's a fun fact. The Gulf of Mexico actually has a dead zone that regularly grows larger than some entire US states. Every summer, a layer of warm water caps the surface, while the Mississippi River dumps a massive nutrient bomb from the Corn Belt right into the mix. This causes algae to bloom, die, and rot, and that decay process literally sucks the life-giving oxygen straight out of the water. Local shrimpers have to check satellite maps the same way pilots check the morning weather just to guess where the red blotches are going to pop up. Some years the dead zone is the size of Connecticut, and other years it's more like New Jersey. But either way, it's a paycheck moving right out from under your boat. 3 days before that happens in the Gulf, the same script plays out in Lake Erie. When summer nutrient loads spike and winds die down, the western basin turns into thick pea soup stretching to the horizon. Microcystis, a toxin-producing cyanobacteria, starts pumping out microcystin that can damage your liver. In 2014, Toledo shut off taps for roughly 500,000 people. Emergency alerts said don't drink it, don't boil it, don't even brush your teeth. Grocery stores became water depots with lines curling into parking lots. That's when people felt phosphorus the hard way. You might be surprised to learn that we don't actually mean to create these massive toxic blooms. Farmers are just trying to feed their crops, and they've been told for generations that missing a single dose at planting time can ruin an entire harvest. Because rain and soil conditions are so hard to predict, they often apply a little extra as a sort of insurance in a bag, just to be safe. On top of that, big livestock operations concentrate so much manure in one spot that certain counties turn bright brown on nutrient maps. These are hotspots where there is simply more phosphorus sitting on the ground than the local fields could ever possibly use. When you add in tile drains that shoot water out of the fields like high-speed veins, you've basically built a direct highway from the fertilizer bin straight to the mouth of the river. Government regulators like to call this non-point source pollution, which is really just fancy talk for it comes from everywhere, so we can't blame any one person. The point sources, like factory pipes you can actually see and photograph, have mostly been cleaned up because cities upgraded their plants and fixed their chemistry. Those were big wins for the environment, but the algae didn't seem to care because the diffuse runoff from the landscape just kept right on coming. It's a pretty awkward situation because you can easily regulate a big factory, but you can't exactly knock on every single barn door with a citation and expect to win your next election. Meanwhile, it's the cities and the taxpayers who end up stuck with the bill. Water treatment plants have to buy expensive new sensors and tons of activated carbon, which makes local budgets groan under the pressure. Tourism also takes a massive hit whenever a popular lake turns neon green and starts to reek like a swamp. Charter boat captains have to cancel their weekend trips, moms start texting each other beach warnings, and kids constantly ask why the water looks so wrong. The irony here is pretty vicious, because we spend billions of dollars mining phosphorus to grow food, and then we spend billions more just to keep that same phosphorus out of our drinking water. What nobody really understood during those early blooms was just how sticky this stuff is once it gets into the environment. In old farming regions, the soil has been soaking up phosphorus for decades, creating what scientists call legacy P. Even if every farmer slammed on the brakes today, that phosphorus bank would still leak back out into the water slow and steady for years. To make matters worse, rainstorms are getting much more intense as the climate warms up, and every heavy inch of rain acts like a pry bar under the soil's surface. The Maumee River has a very long memory, and so do the Chesapeake Bay and the Gulf of Mexico. Let's be honest, the current financial incentives are pushing everyone in the wrong direction. If you're a grower working with razor-thin profit margins, skipping a phosphorus application feels like rolling the dice with your entire livelihood. Insurance companies don't write special policies for perfect weather, and grain buyers aren't paying you a premium for responsible nutrient management. Most people choose to protect their yield, but over 1 million of those tiny individual choices eventually stack up into a giant green smear on a satellite image. But there is a little bit of hope starting to peek through the clouds. Some farm co-ops have started paying for edge-of-field water tests, and certain states are now paying growers to plant cover crops that soak up leftover nutrients. In Ohio, the H2Ohio program pushed for cost-sharing on things like buffer strips and variable-rate fertilizer zones. It's all voluntary for now, but money usually talks louder than words in the farming world. Scientists have set a target to cut phosphorus loads in Lake Erie by 40%. And while that sounds like a lot, it's not some impossible sci-fi number. We can actually get there if enough people start banding their fertilizer instead of just throwing it on the surface.